In this lesson, we're going to perform a basic penetration test. Now, our goal in this lesson is not to make you into a pen tester or to teach you how to use any or all of these tools in depth. But instead, I just wanted to give you a quick introduction so you could see what kind of things a penetration tester will be doing as they try to attack an enterprise network. This includes going through reconnaissance using tools like Nmap to do port scanning, as well as using a tool like Metasploit to be able to launch an exploit and gain access to a remote target. So by the end of this video, we are going to find a target, we're going to exploit that target, and we're going to create some kind of action on that target, such as deleting files, modifying files, or touching files on that system. It's important to realize that for the exam, you will not be asked to perform any of the actions you're about to watch, but instead, I just want you to remember what tool is used for what thing and what kind of actions a penetration tester might do. To perform most of the techniques that we're going to do inside of this basic penetration test, we are going to use Metasploit. Now, Metasploit is a multi-purpose computer security and penetration testing framework that contains a lot of great things inside of it that allow us to be able to do our penetration tests, everything from reconnaissance to exploitation to post-exploitation techniques. Now, Metasploit does come installed by default if you're using Kali Linux or Parrot Linux, which are both considered penetration testing Linux distributions, because it is probably the #1 tool that most penetration testers are going to use. All right, if you're ready, let's jump into the environment and get started. To launch it, simply type in MSF console for Metasploit Framework console and hit enter. When you do that, the Metasploit framework is going to load up. Now it takes a couple of seconds for it to load, and every time you load it, you're going to get a different splash screen. In this case, we have this big C-looking thing with a lot of words in it. Every time you launch it, you're going to get a different one, and usually there's some kind of a joke or pun inside of those. More importantly though, you can see down at the bottom that I have Metasploit Framework version 6.1.27, and it tells me how many exploits, auxiliaries, posts, payload, encoders, NOPs, and evasions there are. Now, what are all of those things? Well, let's talk about them. First, we have exploits. You can see here there are almost 2,200 different exploits. An exploit is simply some piece of code or software that can deliver a payload and do some sort of an attack on a given target. All these different exploits go after different vulnerabilities on different Windows, Linux, mobile, and other systems that you may encounter in the field. The second category we have there is known as auxiliary. Now, auxiliary, there is over 1,100 of these inside the Metasploit framework. This includes scanners, sniffers, fuzzers, spoofers, and other non-exploit features of this toolset. For example, instead of using Nmap to do your port scanning, you can actually use auxiliaries that are set up inside of the Metasploit framework to do that same type of work. The next one we have is what's known as post, and you can see there are 400 as of this version. Now, a post is basically any additional task that you may need to perform on a compromised host, and post stands for post-exploitation, which means once you've broken into the box, what are those things you need to do to maintain persistence, cover your tracks, and other things like that. Next, you'll see we have payloads, and we have almost 600 payloads in this version. Essentially, payloads are what exploits are going to deliver and then run. When you run those payloads, it gives you control over a machine, or it gives you elevated permissions, or something like that. Next, we have encoders, and there's 45 encoders in this version. Now, encoders are used to ensure the payloads make it to their destination in one piece and undetected. You may encode things or encrypt things to bypass different intrusion detection systems, firewalls, router ACLs, and things like that. We also have NOPs. There are 10 different NOPs here. Now, a NOP is a non-operation. NOPs are used to keep the payload sizes consistent across all the different exploit attempts that you're going to do. This is also useful as part of your evasion. And finally, we have evasion. This is a category that has 9 different types of evasion techniques that again you can use as ways to try to get by or get through some sort of defenses that somebody has set up against you. Now you'll notice once you go into the Metasploit framework, you come up to the Metasploit prompt. And here you can see it says MSF6, telling me I am in version 6 of the Metasploit framework. Now when you go and use the Metasploit framework, you need to tell it what tools you want to use. So everything is built up in a specific pattern. They list it out by the module type, saying if it's an exploit, auxiliary, post, payloads, encoders, NOPs, or evasion. Then the platform that you're targeting, Windows, Linux, Apple, etc. Then the target service, SMB, FTP, whatever that happens to be. And then the module name. So to use one of these things, you simply have to list out its name. Now that's easier said than done because there are so many of these, right? But I have one memorized that I use all the time. And so I would just type in use exploit / Windows / SMB / MS 17 _ 010 _ PS exec. Now, what does this say? This says I want to use this exploit that targets Windows systems over SMB using the vulnerability associated with Microsoft patch 010 in the year 2017. And if you're not familiar with this, this was known as Eternal Blue, which was a large vulnerability back in 2017 and made up the core of the ransomware known as WannaCry. When you hit enter, it's going to then load that module for you to use. Notice my prompt has changed. It now says MSF6 exploit, and then in parentheses, what exploit I'm going to be using. Now from here, we would have to look at the different options that are available for this particular exploit. To do that, simply type in options. When you type in options, you'll see all the things in this table that you have to have a setting for in order to use this attack. For instance, do you want to have the setting true or false for debug trace? And this shows extra debug information. You'll notice this is a required field. As you go through, there's going to be different things you're going to use based on this particular exploit. And every exploit and every auxiliary and post and NOP is going to be set up differently. But by using options, you can always see what options need to be made. In this case, one of the things that's required that has not been set yet is the R host, which is the target host you want to go after. For example, if during my information gathering and vulnerability scanning, I identify that there is a workstation with a certain IP address that might be vulnerable to this attack because it was missing this patch, I can then use that as my R host. And to do that, I'll just type in set, the option I want to set, in this case, R host, and then the IP address of that machine. Let's say it was 192.168.1.2 and hit enter. Now you'll see that it has set that R host to that IP address. And if I type in my options again, you will see now that everything that is required has been filled in. And this is the way you use these different tools inside the Metasploit framework. When you see things like R host, that is the remote host or the IP you want to target. R port, the remote port you want to target. Things like L host and L port are the local host and local port. Notice you'll see the payload options down at the bottom. The payload options here is what are we going to do once we run that exploit. Just exploiting something doesn't do you any good. You have to run some kind of code afterwards. And in this case, we are setting up a reverse TCP shell using the Meterpreter shell inside of Metasploit. This will allow us to have a connection to that machine and then do things on that machine that we want to do as part of our post-exploitation, like doing more information gathering, collecting files and doing data exfiltration, changing settings, pivoting to other machines, and all of those type of things. Now, there is a lot to Metasploit, and we're not going to cover all of it in this video because that can be an entire course of 20 to 40 hours on its own. But what you need to understand is that Metasploit is a very powerful framework, and you should be able to understand the very basics of setting up things like options and then running those exploits. If this option was already set up perfectly and I'm ready to run the exploit, to do that, I would simply type in the command run and hit enter. Now, in this particular case, I'm not on a network where there is a vulnerable host at 192.168.1.2. So if I try to run it, it's going to end up failing because it's not going to be able to talk to that particular device because it was unreachable, as you saw here. Now, let me go ahead and show you how we use this in the real world. To do this, I've gone ahead and set up a vulnerable machine called Metasploitable2, and you can download this from Rapid7, who created this. This is a Linux distribution. It is intentionally vulnerable and has lots and lots of different problems with it. And that is good for us to be able to practice on. So what I want to do is I want to get out of this particular exploit. So I'm going to type in exit, and you'll see that that took me out of the entire Metasploit framework. So now that I have a nice clear screen, what we're going to do is we are going to search on this network using Nmap to try to identify what is that particular vulnerable machine's IP address. And I know that it's on the same local area network as I'm in, so I'm just going to type in ifconfig to find out my IP address, which is 172.16.218.128. And so I'm going to use Nmap, and I'm going to scan 172.16.218.1/24 because I'm not sure what the IP address is of that vulnerable machine. When I do this, Nmap is going to go out and scan the entire network of up to 254 hosts on this subnet. Now, as it comes back, you'll see that we found a couple of things. Let me scroll up a little bit so we can see what we have. And you'll see that Nmap went and found two different hosts that were reporting back ports. The first one was located at 172.16.218.1, and that is my router or gateway. And you'll see that there is an Apple file server, and there is UPnP that is open on those particular ports. Now, the more important one is the one that we see here at the bottom, 172.16.218.130. This is my vulnerable machine. And you'll notice there are a lot of different things on this machine. Notice that there are 23 open ports, and these are things like FTP, SSH, Telnet, SMTP, domain, HTTP, RCP bind, and many others. Now, if we wanted to find out more information about these particular ports, we can do that by fingerprinting those ports or using Nmap with a service scan to figure out what they're running. And that's exactly what I'm going to do. So I'm going to use Nmap. I'm going to target just the IP that I want to go after, which is 172.16.218.130. And I want to do that with a service scan of -SV. If I go ahead and hit enter, it's going to go run off and do that scan for me. All right, now that the results are back, we can look at those particular services and see if there's anything that's vulnerable. Now, this is where you'd normally do your information gathering and vulnerability assessment part of your engagement. Now, I've already done this, and I know that port 6667 that is open for IRC using the Unreal IRC daemon is a vulnerable version. And so that's what I'm going to target and show you how to use Metasploit to go after and exploit the vulnerability in that Unreal IRC daemon. To do this, we again need to go back into the Metasploit console. So we're going to go MSF console, and when we get up into that screen again, we are going to use the vulnerability for the Unreal IRC daemon. Now, the first thing I want to do is search for that vulnerability to see if there is any exploits associated with it. So if I type in search IRC, I can hit enter, and all of the things that have IRC in it are going to show up. If you look down at line 18, there is one for exploit /Unix/IRC/Unreal IRCD 3281 backdoor. Now, what this means is that this is an exploit that targets Unix systems, which is what Metasploitable is. It targets the IRC port, which is what was open at 6667, and it targets the Unreal IRC daemon version 3281, and there's a backdoor in that particular version. And so that's what we want to use. Now, to use it, I can type out the entire thing of use exploit /Unix/IRC/Unreal IRCD 3281 backdoor, or I can use it based on its number. And in this case, it's number 18. So I'll go ahead and hit 18, and you'll notice it is now the one listed as my exploit. So we're going to go ahead and look at our options. And for our options, we only need to set two things, the R host and the R port. Now, we already know what the R host is. In this case, we're going to set our R host to 172.16.218.130 and hit enter. Now, the port is port 6667, which is the port that was running on our server. If it was running on a different port, we would just type in set port and the port we want to set it to. Now, I'm going to go ahead and hit options again to make sure it took. And yes, it did. I can see my R host is now there. Now that we have our R host and our port set up, we are ready to run this exploit. But if we do that now, nothing's really going to happen because we've set an exploit, but we haven't set a payload. And a payload is necessary to say, what do you want to do once you exploit this server? So I'm going to show you what that looks like just so you can see the error. And if you hit run, it's going to go off, it's going to try the exploit, but it fails. Why did it fail? Because a payload was not selected. So as you can see, there was no payload. So we have to be able to set a payload. To do this, we're going to type in show payloads and hit enter. And this will show us all of the compatible payloads that are known to work with this particular exploit. And here you can see there are 11 different payloads. To keep things simple, I'm going to use the first one, which is payload/command/Unix/bind Perl, which is going to set up a bind shell on that remote server so that I can connect into it at any time I want and take over the system. To do this, we're going to use set payload and then the name, which is command/unix/bind Perl. Notice this is a little bit different than when you're using an exploit. When you use an exploit, you're going to say use space, and then everything after that is all one big word with the slashes between it. But with payloads, it's set payload and then the command, the system, and the payload you want to use. Go ahead and hit enter there and then hit show options. When you do this, you're going to be able to see the configuration for both the exploit and the payload. For the exploit, we're going to go and connect to that IRC server at 172.16.218.130 over port 6667. We're going to then send a payload that is a bind shell that's going to bind on that IRC server and open up a connection port at 4444. This will allow me to connect to that remote host anytime I want over port 4444 and be able to access this bind shell using Perl. Now, to run this, I'm simply going to type in run and hit enter. You can now see that we are connecting from our Kali machine to that server over port 6667. We sent the backdoor command and we were able to start that bind TCP handler on that remote server of 172.16.218.130 over port 4444. And now I have a valid connection that is called command shell session 1 that is open between my Kali machine 172.16.218.128 from port 46773 over to the remote shell that I created with that bind shell on port 4444 of that IRC server. Now you'll see that nothing really happened. We're just sitting there and we are at basically a blank screen. Why is that? Well, because we're actually at a command prompt, you just don't know it. And so if you want to see where you are, you can use your Linux commands like pwd to figure out what is the working directory you're in. And I am right now in the /etc Unreal directory. If I want to see the files in there, I can type in ls and I get back the answers of donation, license, aliases, and all the other things that are in that directory. If I want to figure out what type of permissions I have, I can do who am I? And when I do who am I am root. I was able to get into this box using root access by running this particular exploit. And that's the way these things work at a very basic level to set up an exploit, set up a payload, and then run an attack. Now, the last thing I want to show you is this concept of sessions. Notice here it said the command shell session 1 was opened. That means there might be other sessions too. What this is that Metasploit allows you to run multiple sessions so you can do multiple different attacks, or if you need to chain exploits across multiple systems, you can do that. Now, right now I'm in session 1 and I'm at the command prompt on this IRC server. If I want to get out of that, I can press Ctrl-Z and this will send that session to the background. When I hit yes, that allows me now to get back to my Metasploit framework prompt. Now I can go and set up a new exploit and a new payload and a new target and run that, and that will become session 2. If I want to see all the sessions that I have going on, I can do that by simply typing in sessions and then -L to list them. You'll notice right now I only have one session because that's all I've done, but I could be working here all day and have 5, 10, 15 sessions running at once. Now, if I wanted to use a different session, I would just type in sessions and the number that I want to use. For instance, session 2 or 3 or 4. In my case, I only have one session, so I'm just going to select session 1, and that brings me right back into session 1. And again, I'm right back on that terminal. And if I do who am I, I'm root. If I do ls, I'm in that directory. If I wanted to create a file or a directory, I can do make directory test. And now if I do ls, you'll see there is this test directory that was just added by me. If I want to remove that directory, I can do remove directory test. And now if I do ls, that test is no longer there. These are all the different things you can do just from a very high level when you start using Metasploit. Metasploit is a truly powerful tool, and it's one that as a pen tester, you really got to become comfortable with. I definitely recommend you take an in-depth course on Metasploit, or you spend some time with Metasploit, its documentation, and some vulnerable machines from VulnHub or Metasploitable 2, and be able to start using this to conduct your attacks and be able to get better at doing pen testing in the real world.